Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeremy Jennings. I'm the head of the School of Politics and Economics here at King's. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all, and many of you might be here for the first time and hope it won't be the last time, so welcome to King's. This is the first of a series of lectures which we will hold under the general theme of making sense of society, and it's an attempt, I think, to open up the incredible range of scholarship and research going on within the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy to a wider audience. And it looks like a wider audience. So there will be more of these events. The next one will be a talk by someone I'm sure you already know of, called Aaronovitch, who leads this centre based at King's in the UK and a changing Europe. Anand is probably the person in this country who knows more about Britain and the European Union than anyone else, and as if he's not got enough to be doing at the moment, we're also asking him to give a lecture to a broader audience. And that'll be the next one, and then the following lecture will be by a colleague who's joined us relatively recently, Professor Rosie Campbell, who heads our Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And so there'll be the next two talks. As I say, the idea is to try and address issues of broad intellectual interest, and in doing so, to, I think, contribute to what King's sees as a very important part of its mission, namely serving society. We take that side of our mission very, very seriously indeed. And so we want to get our research, our knowledge, our expertise out to a wider audience. This evening there'll be a chair who will introduce the speaker and the other people who will be commenting on the talk. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. We will hope to finish by 7:45, and there will be drinks afterwards, and please do all come to have a drink with us afterwards. It'll no doubt be somewhere around here, I'm not exactly certain where, but it'll be somewhere in the vicinity. So once again, many, many thanks for coming. We hope to see you again, and now I hand over to our chair. Thank you.
At the RSS, we love data, we love facts, and we love evidence. So a few years ago, we commissioned Ipsos Mori, in association with King's College, to do some work looking at how the public understand reality. And what we found was that the British public is wrong about nearly everything, which didn't really go down well back at home base. And so, you're sort of thinking, I'm here to find out why everyone else is wrong about everything. No, you are wrong about everything too. So welcome to this fantastic event today to hear from Professor Bobby Duffy, who did that original research at Ipsos Mori, who's now a professor here running the Policy Institute at King's College, who's written this fabulous book, Perils of Perception. If you don't have a copy, you must buy one. Hopefully you'll be selling some on the way out.
No.
No? OK. But Amazon and other providers do stock this book.
Yep.
So he'll be giving you a presentation for about 25 minutes, telling you why most of what you think you knew turns out not to be the case. And we'll then be left with the quandary of what are we going to do about it. We've got two fabulous panellists to help us start answering that question. Professor Jennifer Rubin, who runs the Economic and Social Research Council, which funds a lot of valuable research going on in the UK, providing an evidence base for policy making and for society. And then David Aaronovitch from The Times. And if your immediate thought was the reason I don't know what I'm talking about is because of the media, you can fight it out with him later. Right. We don't have a lot of time tonight, and I am keen to involve the audience, so we'll have lots of Q&A if we can. So let's get started with the show.
Thanks very much for that brilliant introduction from Hetan. So I'm going to talk about the book, Perils of Perception, why we're wrong about nearly everything and some of the lessons that come from that. And as Hetan said, it comes from an initial project that we did between the RSS, Ipsos Mori and King's, and then since then, I think we have to give huge credit to Ipsos and Ipsos Mori for keeping this going, as they've now done 100,000, over 100,000 interviews in up to 40 countries. So this is a massive study to understand people's misperception. And it's incredibly simple. All we do is we get people to guess the reality for their country and then compare it against the actual reality and look at the gap between the two. Very, very simple concept that people get very quickly, but has lots and lots of varied implications. And we've covered a huge range of issues now, from immigration to Muslim populations, vaccine safety, obesity levels, murder rates, happiness, Brexit, and sex. We're going to talk about sex a bit at the end. So we cover a whole range of different issues. And the key conclusion of that is, as Hetan says, we're often incredibly wrong, and that immediately raises the question of why. And that immediately raises the question of what can we do about that, if anything. First thing to say is that this is not a new crisis or phenomenon. It's tempting to just lay it down to alternative facts or fake news or post-truth. But as part of the book, I looked back as far as we could to similar sorts of questions. And there are some that go back to 1940s America, which are some of the similar questions to the ones that we did. And I don't know whether it's reassuring or depressing fact, is that we were just as wrong, or people were just as wrong back then as they are now. You could kind of think that we should have come some distance since then, but we haven't got any worse. So this exists across time, across countries, as we'll see, and across issues. So that points to me to a very wide range of causes. It's just a wide range of causes. And in the book, we split it into two big groups: how we think and what we're told. They're the kind of two big buckets of things that can affect our perceptions of reality. Under the what we're told, we've got very simple things like our own experience, what we actually see and hear ourselves. Then we have this big mess of things around media, social media and technology, technological communications, and politics, which do have an impact. And then it's also about how our brains work. And there's a theory from America called rational ignorance, which effectively says that it's quite rational not to inform yourself about these things because it doesn't really matter. You can't change anything from knowing this. And it's kind of it's a neoliberal American tradition, which is quite useful for thinking about these things, but then it ends in a terrible conclusion, I think, which is effectively cut the state down to the minimum possible size because we spend more time choosing our tellies than choosing our political parties. And there's probably some element of truth in that. But it's a useful frame to think of. What I'm going to talk much more about are biases and heuristics, and I'll give you some examples of those. But there is a maths, statistical skill element to it and a critical literacy element to it too. And we do much more on this in the book, and we've done much more with the RSS, Royal Statistical Society, over time. I won't go into that type of thing, but as humans, we do struggle with lots of mathematical concepts, particularly around risk and probability, which are key things for understanding the world. I'll just show you one example from this, from a study that we did with the RSS, where we asked people, what would make you most proud of your kids? Would it be good at reading and writing, if they were good at reading and writing, or good at numbers? And what do you think most people picked? Just shout out what you think. Numbers, I like this audience. This is a good audience, numbers. Anyone else? Reading and writing. Yeah, so I sort of expected it to be reading and writing, but I didn't quite expect it to be so unbalanced between the two. 55% reading and writing, only 13% good at numbers, a massive underweighting of the importance of mathematical and statistical understanding of the world. But my favourite people in this survey are these people who say, nope, no, neither of those. Not proud of our kids at all. Very harsh tiger parenting going on among that 16%. So this is not just about those kind of simple maths and stats errors that we make. One of the key concepts is called emotional innumeracy. And that's best shown through an example, which we'll do. We'll do a bit of guesswork with you on this. So what we asked across, it was over 30 countries, just picking out a few. What percentage of women and girls aged 15 to 19 in your country do you think give birth each year? So we just asked people that question, compare it with the reality, look at the gap between the two. So who's going to shout out a guess for Britain? Let's do Britain. What do you think the percentage of teenage girls 15 to 19 give birth each year? 0.5%, good guess. 2%? 2-1. So that's just perfect. So we've got an average there, across there, which is exactly correct. So this is too good as an audience. It's 1.4% is the actual incidence of teenage pregnancies, teenage births per year in Britain. It's 2% in the US, a bit higher in Argentina, a bit more of an issue with teenage births. in Argentina, 2% across all of these countries. It is quite a rare occurrence, but that's not the image that people have. These are the average guesses across the public. So you've got 1 in 5 in Britain, 1 in 5 teenage girls giving birth each year. So if you think about that, in an all-girl class of 30, that would be 6 girls giving birth every single year. You have 6 baby showers in your all-girls class every single year. It gives these sorts of gaps. And you see the incredible misperception in Argentina. They know it's a bit of an issue, but they think 37% on average teenage girls giving birth each year. So why is this? It is about the vivid emotional stories that we remember. These are the stories that we have seen. So we are storytelling animals, that is true. We hold on to those and it takes up a bigger space in our minds. It's also the stories that we see in the media, because the media feed us the stories that they know that we will respond to. So I guarantee, the effect of that is I guarantee you'll never see a headline like this in the media. Because it's boring. There is no point in telling that sort of story, but it means that we've got more space for the unusual, more space for the vivid anecdote that's not representative, and we use that in our brains to generalize in a way that's incorrect. And that's basically what emotional innumeracy is. What it says is we overestimate what we worry about as much as worrying about what we overestimate. And this is like a key concept and key thing to understand, that cause and effect run in both directions. That our emotions affect our view of reality as well as the other way round. And that's kind of the crux of emotional innumeracy. So for me, this makes misperceptions it's got an incredibly useful side effect. It makes misperceptions useful indicators of what we're really worried about. If you ask people's opinion on what they're worried about, there's all sorts of biases within that. There's a very immediate reaction if you ask people what's their view of the reality, and it reveals quite a lot of what people are actually underlying concerned about. It has lots of downsides too, though. It means that you can't just use facts to convince people or change their minds, because it misdiagnoses part of the cause. It's partly emotional, these responses that are not just driven by facts. And what that means is simple or simplistic myth-busting is seldom the full answer on its own. You cannot just shift people in these types of things with simplistic myth-busting. We've kind of learned that over the years in some ways. There's a second element to this, which kind of goes to the Hans Rosling, Max Rosa view of things and Steven Pinker view of things, is we're also useless at spotting slow positive changes. So this is the trend in trends in birth rates per 1,000 females aged 15 to 19 in the US, across different ethnic groups. An incredible decline from 1990 to 2014, this over halved, and well over halved for some of the groups. So there has been these big shifts in this, and you don't see headlines about this. We don't notice these types of changes because, again, it's quite boring. So small incremental improvements are quite boring for us as humans and for the media to report on. We're much more tuned to sudden negative impacts from things. And so in that context, when you see from academic studies in both the UK and the US that 80 to 90% of media coverage of Muslims is negative, you can imagine what sort of effect that has on people's perceptions. So it's really, really easy to find negative headlines about Muslims. Muslim convert beheads women in garden. Muslim plot to kill the Pope. This is not an extremist's plot to kill the Pope. This is a Muslim plot to kill the Pope. Incredible slackness in how people think about those things. Very poor reporting of survey work. 1 in 5 Brit Muslim sympathy for jihadis. Really simplistic looking at that. And then Donald Trump features a lot in the book and a lot in this type of thing. But Trump, I think Islam hates us. Again, not extremist haters, but Islam hates us. Some terrible treatments of that. So it's no surprise that there's big overestimates of the Muslim population as a result from people's perceptions. So we asked this again across over 30 countries, just picking out these ones as examples. Anybody know what percentage of Brits are Muslim? Sorry, 6? 631? It's actually, at the time of the survey, it was 5. It probably is closer to 6 now in terms of when it was 6. 1% in the US. France is 18%, but these are the guesses. again, from people. 16%, people thinking 1 in 6 people in Britain are Muslims. Incredible overestimation in the US, 17%, getting up to 1 in 5 people are Muslim in the US, and then in particular, misperception in France. 3 in 10 when it's only 8%. These massive overestimations. We actually went on to ask, what do you think it will be in 4 or 5 years' time? And the French answer was 4 in 10. That 4 in 10 French people in 4 or 5 years' time will be Muslim. These massive overestimations in people's heads. And this is related to social psychology effects that have been well studied, that we tend to focus on negative information. When we see negative information, it works differently in our brains. And there's lots of great work on this. This is from John Cacioppo, late great now, John Cacioppo from Chicago University, who wired people up to MRI scanners and showed them positive and negative images and measured where in the brain lit up and to what intensity the brain lit up, looking at these different sorts of images. So he showed positive images, things that have been tested to be positive, which always excites me that in America the positive image was pizza. I like that. They've got pizza and Ferraris were the 2 positive images that they used in America for positive links in people's brains. And then, so they measured that, and then they showed negative images. And the negative images they showed were things like dead cats, which, just wait for a second, that is not a dead cat. Just to be absolutely clear, that cat is not dead, it is just resting. It's just having a little lie down. I did have to have a look at lots of images of dead cats in order to do this, including the ones that John Cacioppo used. And I couldn't show them to you in an environment like this because it does have a different reaction with people. And it's kind of like a live example of how actually we don't like looking at that because it does have a reaction to it. So that cat, if you just remember, don't remember the dead cat. I don't want to be known as the dead cat guy because that is, from all the experiments, that's the thing you're likely to remember most. But that's not a dumb fault in our brain. That focus on negative information is not something dumb. It's actually evolutionary. Because in cave people days, when negative information tended to be more urgent, tended to be the sort of stuff you had to act on. So if there was a lurking saber-toothed tiger and someone warned you about it and you didn't take any notice of it, you were edited out of the gene pool. So we are literally descendants of people who took a lot of note of negative information. And that has lots of implications for how we react to other stuff. And this is where the sort of loss aversion things come in, that we feel losing money, losing friends, and getting criticism more than winning money, getting new friends, and getting praise for things. Also has, again, an interesting side effect from a personal relations point of view, is that because we overweight the negative, the correct balance in a positive relationship, personal relationship with someone, is not 1 positive interaction with 1 negative interaction. It's 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction. So if you want to have a good relationship with someone, you need 5 times as many date nights or good things that you're doing with them as arguments, which is advice we could all take probably on that. So that sort of overweighting of the negative thing is not a dumb fault. It's actually built into us. But that has a key implication for us, which is that things are literally mostly not as bad as we think. That's that we are programmed to think in that type of way. So things are literally mostly not as bad as we think, which is a really important point. The second element of that is we also tend to think things are getting worse, and that's related to an effect called rosy retrospection, which is another social psychology one, which means what it sounds like, that we just think of the past as better. And you can see that from murder rate type things. We asked this across lots of countries. Do you think the murder rate in your country is higher, lower, about the same as it was in the year 2000? Up to 2016, this was. And it was down quite significantly, down in 25 out of the 30 countries, and not by a little bit, by quite a lot, 29% on average. But only 15% in the blue bars there actually thought it was lower. Across all these countries, only 15% of people thought it was lower. Over 40% of people thought it was higher. The rest thinking it was about the same or not knowing. Incredibly wrong perceptions of things in places like South Africa, where it's been down quite significantly, but over 80% of people thinking it's actually increased over that sort of period. US more or less in line. Anybody know what happened to the murder rate in Britain over that sort of period? sort of given you a massive clue by saying it's down in 25 out of 30 countries. So sort of anyone who says higher is not listening very closely. So it's down. Yeah, it's down over 20% in Britain too over that type of period, but only 1 in 5 people think it is actually down over that sort of period. So we've got this sense of the past is better than it was. And there's, again, been great experiments, this one by Terence Mitchell, another US professor from Washington University, who did it in a much more prosaic way. What he did was interviewed people before going on their holidays, different groups of people, during their holidays and then after their holidays, and then kept tracking them over time. And everyone goes in this same sort of lovely roller coaster ride, where we go from excited anticipation before we go on our holidays. Everyone is very excited to be going. Then we get there, and there's the reality of minor niggles when you're there. It doesn't quite all go to plan when you're on holiday, and then you return with this sense of mild disappointment when you're back. So you're a bit down about being back, but a bit down about how the holiday went. And everyone goes through the same sort of thing. So it's okay if you felt like that in the past. It sort of happens. And but he kept interviewing them, or his team kept interviewing them into the future. And what happens is the memory grows fonder the longer away we get from the holiday. So you forget the kids being sick in the car, and you remember the long walks on the beach and the sunsets and all the other stuff. So we kind of edit out. Again, not a dumb fault of our brain. It's quite healthy to let go of bad things from the past, but it has a consequence, which is that we think the past was better than it was, and the future, current and the future, is less good than it is. And this is what politicians and others play on, in some senses, that sense of decline. If it bleeds, it leads is a well-known cliche for a reason, that focus on threat and crime in particular. So this was a famous Donald Trump thing that he said several times on 2016 campaign trail. The murder rate in our country is the highest it's been in 47 years, right? You won't hear the press saying that. There was a very good reason you wouldn't hear the press saying that, because it wasn't true. It's just not true. There was a tiny kernel of truth, is that it's seen the biggest year-on-year increase in cities for about 40 years, but it was still about half the level of 47 years ago. So it wasn't at all true, but he does that a lot. It also does something that's quite important in how these things are communicated, about connecting unconnected trends. So this was his famous intervention in the UK, just out. UK crime rises 13% annually amid spread of Islamic terror. Not good, we must keep America safe. And the fact was crime had gone up, nothing to do at all with Islamic terror or terror of any sorts, all sorts of other reasons for it. And it led to Fraser Nelson's best ever tweet, I think. Amid is a word loved by fake news websites to conflate correlation with causation. UK crime is also up amid spread of fidget spinners, which is that connecting of cause and effect, very powerful, because people want to understand a causal relationship between things. Final sort of data point on this is all of that so far is quite neutral in some ways, as in we're all subject to those sorts of biases, but it's not directionally without cause. So this is directionally motivated reasoning is kind of the group of things around confirmation bias, disconfirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, those types of things that we kind of believe what we want to believe. So our misperceptions are directionally motivated as well, which is, just show you one example of this. We asked this in the latest survey, Ipsos asked this in the latest survey. In the US, do you think more people are killed by guns, knives, or other violence? We asked it in other countries too, but let's just use the US as an example. What's your guess? Guns, knives, or other violence? Guns. Other. Oh, interesting. Other. Guns and other. It's actually firearms. By some considerable distance, it's 68% of all interpersonal violent deaths are in the US up through firearms. This doesn't include suicide. This is, which is even worse on those sorts of figures, but interpersonal violence, 68%, second only to Colombia, where it's 76% of deaths, interpersonal violence deaths are due to firearms. Are due to this. And so the guess in America, the average guess in America was 59% said firearms. And actually, the thought we had was, why doesn't everyone know it's guns in America? Because sitting from where we are, it does seem quite obvious. But the reason is to do with this. this amazing spread. The same reality of gun deaths in America seen entirely differently, depending on whether you're a strong Democrat. 83% of you correctly think that it's guns. 27% of strong Republicans think it's guns. So we've got entirely different views, worldviews of the same reality, depending on your political identity and what you believe about these types of things. So these are not neutral. There's many, many more examples of effects in the book. How am I doing? Oh, not too bad. Many more examples of effects in the book. Just quick guess on sex. So this is an interesting one. We asked people, how often in a month do young people aged 18 to 29 have sex? So guess. People are much more reticent about this one. They're happy to guess about teenage pregnancy or Muslim populations, but sex is kind of, people go a bit more fidgety. How many times do young people aged 18 to 29 have sex in a month? 5, 6, perfect, very good. That's spot on, 5 or 6, that's what it kind of comes out at. That sort of level, depending on which country and which sex. The average guess is 17 times. 17 times a month. And the average guess of men for young women is 22 times a month. And the average guess of young men for young women is 32 times a month. It's incredible misperception, which we can go into the reasons for that, maybe in panel or later. Obesity, incredible misperceptions of obesity. Very quickly, what would you guess is a proportion of Brits that are overweight or obese? 6, shout it louder. 27, 60, very good, 62%. But there was lots that were lower there, and that's the same in the country as a whole. We guess much, much lower than the 62% that it actually is. Incredible prevalence of that. Just so I won't get you to guess on this, but the actual amount that you need in your pension in order to get annual pension, an annuity of around 17 grand to add to your 7 grand state pension to get about 24 grand is about £350,000. But the average guess is £100,000. So people think you only need £100,000 in your pension pot in order to have a fairly average amount of income. And that's incredibly damaging for people's understanding of their financial future, particularly because it's the only people who are much more accurate are people who are already retired when it's too late, which is a shame. Vaccines, very damaging. One of the most damaging, probably the most damaging misperception that in all of these types of misperceptions is that still 6 in 10 people around the world think there positively is a link between vaccines and autism in healthy children, or are unsure whether there is or not. Only 4 in 10 people around the world are completely sure that there isn't a link. And this is awful in terms of people's behaviour, in terms of people's support for their children to be vaccinated, and has real impacts. So it's one of those things that just doesn't let go over time. Very, very damaging. And then we got all the way through without mentioning Brexit at all. So I'm not going to say much about Brexit, except that what we found on all the ones that we've asked, from whether you believe the £350 million claim to the impact of immigration, nothing has changed in the last 2 years. People's misperceptions of the impact of immigration and whether the £350 million claim is right or wrong have unchanged in the past 2 years. So we've done absolutely nothing in all this discussion to improve people's knowledge of some of the basic facts around Brexit. So, final couple of points. As I say, there's no sign that we've got any less of a reality-based view than in the past, but I am worried about the future because the online environment does threaten it at a new scale. And that includes things like the Russian Minister of Defense saying information is another type of armed forces, very openly talking about information as a type of armed forces. That is the case, but it includes that, but it's not that. It's much, much broader than information disorder or quite small concept of fake news, much, much broader. And it's around the twin effects of our own filtering of the information that we see, and then the unseen algorithms that filter the information for us, that push things towards us that people want us to see. And that's because, very simply, more time on the platforms means more cash for the platforms themselves and other people associated with it. So there is built into the model confirmation bias, showing us what we want to see. So surveillance, we know surveillance is the business model of the internet overall, and apparently free internet is based on being able to survey us. But that means that confirmation bias is its currency, and Facebook have shown this themselves in the sense of running their own tests of mixing up their feed and counting time that we spend on the platforms. And people do click away faster. So it is built in. They may take steps to improve and mix up our feed, but still the whole system is built on showing us what we want to see or what we think we want to see. So that's a real challenge. Final slide then for me is what does this mean for facts and evidence, just to set up some of the discussion. So I think there's loads of great books on two sides of this. The politicians and the media points, loads of great books on post-truth and fake news and what does the political environment mean. There's loads of great books on our faulty thinking and the kind of social psychology effects. What the book tries to do is make sure that we understand this is a systemic issue, that one feeds into the other. They're not separate issues. You can't talk about post-truth without talking about how our brains work and vice versa. And I think that is the crux of this, so thinking of it as a system. And in that context, in this type of discussion, that's where multidisciplinary social science really helps, being able to look at this thing not just from one perspective, not just from a social psychologist perspective, not just from a political science perspective, but from across the board, and that's what we should do. There are a few reasons to be helpful, to be hopeful. Our biases are striking. One of the key things in social psychology is you see lots of things that are striking about our faulty thinking, but they don't determine all our thoughts. Not everyone falls into those types of traps. We don't do it all the time. We're not automatons. I mean, you need to bear that in mind. It can sometimes come across as we're all slaves to that when we're not. Rising polarization and tribal identities are definitely a risk. We don't completely understand them yet. We need to do more on that. But we're not entirely wedded to one party or one viewpoint. And you can see that in huge potential, I think, in deliberative approaches, greater use of deliberation among the public. They're much more reasonable, much more balanced than sometimes comes across from the quite shrill debates around this. And then a final point on facts and evidence and emotion, that they're not, we can fall into thinking that they're in opposition, that you can either have stories or you can have facts, but you can't have both. In some ways, the communications campaigners among us over the years have sort of encouraged that, where we said myth-busting doesn't work, so let's go with stories only with people. And that is a false opposition. That's not how the brain works. That's not what works with people. So what the key thing is to marry the two together, use the data, use the facts to tell the story better. But if you only remember one thing, one key takeaway from the whole session, it's that the cat is alive and well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating talk and so many interesting concepts and things for us to think about and think about what we could do about them as well. I'm going to try to keep my remarks very short because I know we have an enthusiastic audience in the room as well, and as you'll see at the end, I'm going to ask you what we need to do about it and what I can fund to help you do that. So I'm obviously very pleased that Bobby said that this will require multidisciplinary social science as the head of the ESRC, and I'm hoping that this was actually all orchestrated as one gigantic pitch, and you're all going to come with fantastic ideas at the end of it. But in the context of political polarization, growing use of technology, there are serious questions about our biases and misperceptions, what we believe, what kinds of things stick when we hear them. These are really important questions that we need to examine in some detail. So government, the research community, the wider public are all rightly very concerned about it. Probably always should have been, but I think today, as Bobby said, with technology and the potential to magnify the impact of misperceptions, it's really important to think about it more than ever. However, I think it's also worth a bit of perspective. I think in recent years, people have started to wonder if expertise really matters anymore, whether we've had enough of experts. And actually, if we want to sort of myth bust or break a misperception, it does seem to be the case, at least according to Mori data, that for several decades, trust in experts, if you at least count professors like some of us, and medics, doctors, that the trust in experts is still very high and has been for many, many years. So hopefully, if we find some interesting findings and communicate them well, we will be able to make a difference with that. So I'll just say a few quick things that I think might be able to help, and then where I think ESRC would like to go with this. And I suppose the first thing in terms of what we can do to help is that we may want to think about starting early and keeping going with critical thinking skills. It's clearly the case that we could do more in schools to help people understand the provenance of information, what they're reading, think about what kinds of questions they should be asking of what they're hearing, what they're reading, and of what they're being told. And we can do this in a way that we also help their parents understand so that gets reinforced at home. Andy Oxman and his colleagues have trialed ways of helping school children think about the health information they're given. And they've done something that they called helps increase kids' bullshit detectors. And what they found is that if you get kids asking questions about who's telling me this, why are they telling me this, is this just a story about one person, or is there a wider evidence base that tells me that this is a wider phenomenon, then it really helps kids understand what evidence really is and what they should be believing and what should they be questioning further. So I think we could think about what kinds of initiatives like that we could be rolling out and really testing and evaluating them to see. I imagine they work beyond health information. So a second thing I think we could do is to think about both a very inelegant term, pre-bunking as well as debunking. And what I mean by that is, so Sander van der Linden and his colleagues at Cambridge have been doing research to show that if you actually, when people in the moment go in to read or think about a piece of information, if you say to them that this website hasn't been fact-checked, or sometimes people make up statistics in order to support their facts. In fact, I think 42% of people make up statistics. But that it does actually change the critical nature with which they then approach that information, and they will think about it, is this really true, and what's the source of this information? So I think you can do very much in the moment sort of things like that that go up on websites or warnings that flash up if there isn't certainty about where the information is coming from. I think even Wikipedia does that quite well. It sometimes says there's more information needed to fill in this section, and we don't have enough facts about this. So it's also the case that that's called pre-bunking in this work, but debunking also, we have increasing, I think, instances of fact-checking in the media, and I think that sometimes, even if it doesn't change our perceptions all the time, it does sometimes help, and it does actually, I think, potentially have a deterrent effect, because media sources will know that they are likely to be held to account for things that they say or promise. I won't spend much time on the third one, which is wider systemic interventions, because I suspect there are those who are much more expert in thinking about what the media can do differently or should be doing differently. But we have a lot of, obviously, current interest in wider systemic questions about how we can regulate the social media and the Cairn-Cross review and findings about what media should be doing more broadly. So I'll just end with some thoughts about the ESRC in particular, and what ESRC can do about this. I have a few ideas, and then I really hope that in the discussion you'll all come with some too, and we'll be able to fund some. So we could continue to fund lots of excellent research, and some of it I hope will cover things like our political systems and belief systems within or between countries and people actually polarizing, or is that a misperception? How do people get their news and their information, and what do they trust? How is this changing over time? How susceptible are our information systems to abuse? And I think this is a very, very live question at the moment as we think about foreign powers actually starting to own some of our potential critical infrastructure. How do we inoculate people? That's what pre-bunking could do. How do we inoculate people against misperceptions and improve their critical thinking skills? How do we make it easier for people to critically read and interpret the information that they're getting? And at the systemic level, what kinds of regulatory and wider environmental changes might we want to support? So second, as ESRC, apart from funding things like that and more, I'm sure you have even better ideas, we can also walk the talk ourselves, so we can make sure that the research we fund is very rigorously peer-reviewed, that it's trusted and trustworthy, that we're careful about what claims people are making in the research they've undertaken, so that you can have small qualitative studies and stories almost in some case studies, but be careful what claims are being made from that and what statistical power you need to be able to make broader, more generalized claims. We can, thirdly, I think, work with colleagues like the Royal Statistical Society, and we are doing so, to try to understand how we can improve the use of data and statistics and the relationship between different kinds of evidence in research and in the research landscape. And we can also support initiatives like the What Works centres and impact acceleration accounts that are things that university researchers and others contribute to that are helping build the evidence base that helps us know what we really can be doing in all these kinds of areas. And I think it's really important that we continue to do that. My hope for those kinds of areas is that we're building an ecosystem in which policymakers, practitioners, doctors, teachers, people in the media are actually starting to understand better what evidence they need in order to make claims about the things that they're, or decisions about the things that they're working on. And if we build that ecosystem, there'll be greater trust between researchers and media and practitioners and policymakers, and an understanding of where they can go to for that information. But I think one of the things that's absolutely crucial in this is that we think about how when we know something, when we have a really solid evidence base, how do we communicate that in ways that people will really trust and change their minds about it? And I don't think that's something we've really cracked at all. So really keen to hear everybody's thoughts.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
David, over to you for some thoughts as well.
Thank you very much. By the way, at the bottom left-hand side, is that the new King's College logo? Compliment it on its innovative quality and so on. And actually kind of slightly reflects my state of mind at the moment. Hetan and I had a very brief conversation before we began, and I said, well done on getting so many people here. And he said, well, people love hearing about how they get things wrong. And then he corrected himself. He said, no, he said, they love hearing about how other people get things wrong. I certainly do, as somebody who is paid to be constantly right about these things. I am, in my own opinion, one of the most consistently correct people that you will find. And if you want to know anything about anything and be kind of reasonably sure you've got it right, I'm one of the guys to ask. I see a number of other people of a similar kind of, mostly men, of a similar disposition. So the first question, which I always thought, and I remember when we first discussed this at Ipsos Mori at an event about 4 or 5 years ago, the first question that was raised was, does this actually matter? Does it matter that people misperceive things? One of the things, for instance, that you can see in these statistics, which is quite interesting, you saw it both on teen births and you saw it on the question of Muslims in the country, was that although people were wildly exaggerated, they were wildly exaggerated in roughly the correct proportions to their actual results. In other words, France had the biggest level of thinking they had more Muslims, and they did. Argentina had by far and away the biggest problem of, if you regard it as a problem of teenage births, we usually do think of it as a problem, than anybody else, and sure enough, their figure was wildly... In other words, is this simply signalling to you that people know they've got a problem, but they're not expected to know exactly what the scale of the problem is? And on the whole, they're more likely to go for a bigger number than a smaller number, because that seems to reflect in the kind of general tone of what they see around them and the stories that they hear. Does that actually matter, therefore? When people say, as they always do, that immigration is too high, they never not said that immigration is too high. I think I'm right in saying, and some of my very good friends from polling organisations are nodding their heads, they've always said that immigration is too high. They've said immigration is too high when there was net emigration to Britain. So they've always said it. It's not always mattered that that's what they've said. So is actual salience, i.e. what people get stoked up about, more important than what their perception actually is? So this becomes a discussion, a part of the discussion. But then Bobby rightly raises the question of vaccination. herd immunity for measles is 94% vaccination rate, occurs at 94% vaccination rate. Now, it doesn't matter if 20% of people don't believe it works, don't necessarily believe it works, but if they actively take action based on the idea that their children may actually be at significant risk of autism, then everybody loses their herd immunity, and you have a situation where people actually die as the consequence of a social misperception. That is actually happening now in Italy. Interesting, I should raise Italy. Amongst the stats that you did have is that when you looked at an average of where people got the things wrong, Italians were the wrongest people of all about everything. Sorry, I see an Italian amongst you who's just gone very cross about this. You are, aren't you? Yeah, I thought so. And that may be, I suddenly thought to myself, why they've ended up with easily the worst government in the in Western Europe. And there really are now, including governments that deny the problem, deny that there is no link between autism and vaccination, as it happens. So I think the first thing to say is that to me, salience probably matters more than actual perception, but that actual perception does matter to a significant degree. And I also kind of think that as a sort of, person of the Enlightenment, that actually in general it's better if people know how things really are than rather than how they imagine them to be. So the next question is, was it ever thus? Isn't this always been true? One of the things you could argue is that people have been on feedback loops forever. And indeed, Bobby mentioned this. So let's take an example. Isn't it awful how Rupert Murdoch's son has shaped popular view of X, Y, and Z? He just takes an issue, decides what he thinks about it, sticks it out there in his paper, and before you can say whatever you want to say, deport a Muslim, everybody believes that actually it is that way and so on, and you have a major kind of social problem. Well, anybody who works on The Sun will tell you, who's worked on it for any length of time, that actually what they do is feel very carefully for what the pulse of their readers already is and try and locate it. So the cleverness that they have is actually pretty much picking winners before they happen, because they've sensed how their readers are going to go. So there's always been a significant feedback loop, and you could say, well, therefore this is something that has been continuous. And Bobby also in the figures related to that and said we are no worse than we were. However, the fact is we should be a great deal better, because the other truth about modern society is we are vastly better educated than we were at the end of the 40s. So how come we're misperceiving things at roughly the same rate as people who had significantly less, who were essentially were leaving school at 16 or 15, were just as bad or just as good at perceiving things correctly as a place where we now turn out 50% of our population as higher education graduates? Not really something to be proud of. And just this morning, my friend Jamie Bartlett, who some of you may know, was tweeting out that the problem also is that it's getting worse. Because although I refer to the feedback loop already existing, the famous algorithms which feed back to you the things that you already wanted to know and so on, without you even having to go to them, completely replace those kind of compendious situations whereby you would come across other information accidentally. By the way, this is a very, very big argument for the BBC. A very big argument for the BBC. Because one of the things that an organisation like that does is perforce brings people together willy-nilly. And as you try and fragment things like that and so on, then you create a situation where they silo even more. Okay, so was it ever thus? Yes, but should it be a great deal better? Yes, and could it conceivably get considerably worse? Yes, and therefore, what shall we do about it? And this is, and here you, and Jennifer suggested it, here you plunge straight away into probably the second biggest question convulsing government at the moment. after Brexit. It's convulsing the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I was at a full-day seminar for all their civil servants and a number of others about 6 months ago, where they were discussing all the various threats that fake news and false information and siloing and so on, and the sort of things that were available online were creating for people. And we had the report of the Select Committee this week, which was talking about things like should we regulate tech companies and so on, how we would regulate tech companies, but has also begun to talk about should we be offering some kind of subsidy so that trusted news organisations and trusted local news organisations were given money in some way or given encouragement to exist, because otherwise the algorithm would dry them out because people wouldn't be driven to them, because people would be driven by their own preferences and past behaviours and so on. A very, very bleak assessment of where we are and where we're going. So those are the thoughts that I just want to kind of leave with you, which most of which you've already thought of and so on. And just say that this discussion that we're having now is one we can have with a degree of knowledge that we're engaging in one of the important discussions.
Great, thank you.
So you've had some super input from our panel so far. We've got about 20 minutes before we open for drinks. So what I think I'll do is just open up to the floor, take a collection of reactions from you, quick ones, questions or comments, but 15 seconds or so. We'll gather as much as we can and then come back to the panel, because I think if we do it in several rounds, we'll run out of time. So there are some roving mics. Put up your hands. So we've got somebody back there. And then, I don't know if we've got a second mic, but it's two people over there. Please do kick off, whoever's got the mic.
Shall I start? So can I just ask a quick question out of interest? What happens in terms of age groups, in terms of people's, do people get more fixed in their ways or not? Okay. What's the evidence?
So we'll come back to all of these later. Has the mic got to the back over there somewhere? There are a couple of people there. Oh dear, we're losing all our mics. Come on, people. So somebody here.
Question for Bobby Duffy. Your firearms example made it look as if Democrats are much closer to reality than Republicans. Could you equally easily have picked an example where the opposite was the case, or should we conclude that left-wingers are closer to reality than right-wingers?
Okay, very good. And then back there.
So essentially, sorry, a bit loud. Referring back to Brexit, Michael Gove said during the campaign to leave the European Union that people don't care about experts anymore. That was probably the most prescient and accurate thing to come from either campaign. And is the problem that we have now not that misperceptions are happening to more or less the same degree, but that they're being weaponized by politicians in a way that's highly effective all over the world?
Great. And I think there was somebody sort of just behind you there.
I have a slightly more esoteric question I wondered if I could hear the panel's reflections on. So a lot of what we heard about was around critical thinking faculty and the role that plays in altering perception. I would like to hear your reflections on the role of internal intuition as a data source and a driver for altering the way we think and experience the world.
Okay, there's somebody back there.
Not a loud voice.
Go on.
You talk a lot about how to change society-wide perception. What can you do if you come across an individual where you go, oh, here's all these facts that show this and that, and they go, yeah, I don't believe that. I believe what I believed before. I believe that vaccines cause autism. I believe that handguns are totally safe in the hands of 14-year-olds. How do you combat an individual who just doesn't care about facts?
Okay. Yeah.
If levels of misperception have been constant over time, why have governments not tried to address them previously, or have they, and with what effect?
Okay.
Good.
Was there anyone else sort of back there? Yeah, there was the lady. I think I was trying to start with you, so you really ought to get your say. Let's make this the last one, and we'll come back to the panel.
Okay. Hi, thank you. I'm an ESRC-funded PhD student looking at how to get policymakers to use mental health research. And if you had any thoughts on how to tackle the biases that might be specific for those policymakers, because it's quite tricky, and yeah, I would be interested. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Cool. So, Bobby, do you want to kick off? And you've got a specific one about age, I think. But
there's so many there. I'm sort of... Let me get... There's loads of stuff I want to say about those. So, on the age point, so older people tend to be better, but it's not very consistent. It does tend to vary by issue. So it's not that you get more stuck in your ways and you kind of don't update your view. It is actually across the different issues. There is a benefit to age, but not very marked. Not many actual subgroup differences in terms of the big predictor is education levels, controlling for age and other things, education levels. And interestingly, the Italian point is our Italian team were delighted when they won the medal for the most misperceiving country in the world. They were genuinely delighted. I don't think you've offended the Italian person, so I think they were genuinely delighted. And the thing that we found that was most related cross-nationally was this measure of emotional expressiveness, because these admitting to these sorts of more expressive views about your view of reality is probably related more to that than education levels, media level, media quality, political things, all of those types of things.
That sounds horribly like a national stereotype.
It is. It is, and it works. It does work, and there is some truth in those types of things. Germany and Sweden at one end, Italy and the US in the other, and it is actually measured sort of through an objective index of emotional expressiveness that Erin Meyer came up with. So anyway, but that's...
If you trust professors, this is true.
This is true, which people do. Jen's right. Jen was right. Absolutely. God, I can't even remember the other ones now. So there was so many.
Democrats.
The Democrats. Yes, so that's a tough one. We do try to be balanced, but trying to find things that the more liberal, left-leaning are more wrong on is quite tough. So if we've got ideas, which sounds terrible, but it is. If people have got ideas on those types of things, those types of measures, very keen to look at them more.
Did we look at tax take?
We did look at tax take, and so yes, that's a good example. Is people do underestimate the amount of tax that the wealthy contribute to the tax take, but it wasn't particularly biased one way or the other politically. It was quite consistent across groups, so it wasn't a massive distinguishing factor between left and right or anything else.
So Republicans are like Italians.
Yeah,
Italians are like that because they're more emotionally expressive.
This is not the quotes I want from this. This is a serious social science session, David.
I'm just going to bring Jennifer in.
Just a very brief comment on that. There is some research on whether liberal-leaning people are more critical, analytical in their thinking or not. And this is not a political statement on my part. There is research that says that liberal thinking people, which is more likely to be Democrat than Republican, are more likely to be critical, analytical thinkers than Republicans in America.
I was actually being serious too. Those of you who've read Jonathan Haidt's book and so on will be aware of the idea that one of the things that liberals don't understand about conservatives is the deep emotionalism of the beliefs that they hold. And so when we might say that Republicans might be a bit like the Italian stereotype we just said, this actually might be analytically true.
Yeah, so Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory is really, really useful in this, because what he says is that people approach these things from completely different angles, and it's kind of really hard for one side to communicate to the other, and that is not an incorrect view, it's just a completely different moral basis for this that is genuinely held and colours, I think. Really, really important. Good to do more of that in the UK, because I think testing, that's very much US evidence. Let's see what the UK evidence says on those types of things, because it'd be really, really interesting to look at those types of things. Have I got longer, or do you want to go?
Let's move around a bit. Yeah. So, Jennifer, I mean, come on anything, but you had somebody that you're funding right now asking for a bit of policy advice, so that might be one to pick up on amongst others.
So, can I give policy advice on how to help mental health research make a difference? I mean, I actually think that there are some ways that people are developing of getting researchers and policymakers together in rooms to discuss findings, and I think some kinds of secondments are really helping to build those relationships and that trust, which it makes it more likely that people will be listening to what researchers are saying. I think certain kinds of very brief, message-driven, not journal articles that policymakers A can't access and B won't read, but brief policy headline messages can be very helpful. I think saying things constructively rather than just starting with the government's all wrong about, saying that actually there are some policies that can help with, are some ways of doing it. So I think there are various approaches, both in terms of publishing your own findings, but also in terms of interacting with the kinds of people making decisions that I think can make a difference. Could I just come to the question about intuition for a moment? Really good question, and I think it's worth actually breaking out some of the different kinds of drivers for decision making, because I suppose one could come away with the idea that we're saying rational, evidence-based decision making is the only way to make decisions, and one could argue, but people do make a lot of decisions based on intuition or emotion or moral judgment and politics and ideology as well. And so what does that really mean? In terms of intuition, I think intuition is an interesting one, because it doesn't seem to me that it's necessarily, maybe it's not my field, so do challenge me on this, but it does seem to me that it's sort of what happens when you don't have full information, and so you go, I guess the expression would be on your gut feeling. But actually, that really is normally a quick way of saying, what information do I have at the moment, and how can that inform my thinking? We do normally have quite a lot of information at our fingertips. So if the idea is, I haven't heard from this friend for a little while, they were quite down when I last saw them, I better check on them. I have this hunch that they might not be very well, I better check on them. That might be you might call that your intuition, but there are lots of data points you've used to come to that intuition or that hunch that you need to check on someone. And actually, sometimes that works, and it's good to kind of go with a note of caution probably in instances like that. But there are lots of times when people go on intuition and make decisions about, say, policies or programs or interventions, like trying to get kids to go into prisons who they think are at risk of ending up in prison, and thinking that will help scare them out of a life of crime. And the evidence shows that's not what happens, that it makes them more likely to actually commit crime and end up in prison. And so, we don't really want to rely on intuition for some kinds of judgments. If it's a question of, should I check on my friend who I'm worried about? Probably pretty safe to do that. If it's, should I set up this policy or program because I think it might work? Maybe proceed with caution and at least quite a lot of evaluation.
David? Notice, friend in the gallery, how we approached you crab-like sideways to your question about what to do about the person who won't take the fact for an answer and otherwise doesn't want to know, because actually quite a lot of what we said has approached that issue. Let's take the issue of, however, your dilemma. There you are. I suppose the first question you have to ask is, does it really matter whether your friend knows the truth or not? I mean, does it actually matter? How much effort are you going to expend upon it? Once you've decided that maybe it does, I think what you've got to establish, we have to establish, is how important it is to him to know what the truth is. In other words, is it of any utility to you to know the truth behind this? And if the honest answer is no, not really, I'm actually kind of rather settled into my feeling about what this is like, then there is again a kind of limited utility in dealing with it. Now, of course, it's when you scale him up and you sit against a problem that requires a kind of policy answer that it becomes much more difficult. So, for example, what should our policy on immigration be, given people's perceptions about immigration? Should you, let's say this is a kind of perpetual problem for me in what I do, particularly when dealing, as we're encouraged to do, with under-the-line commenters at the Times, many of whom display exactly this kind of attribute. When they say, as somebody did to me under a piece about 3 weeks ago, 37% of Muslims are unemployed. There is, you know, I've seen this in a report somewhere. And you think, okay, I'll go back on that. And what I discover is that 37% of Muslims are economically inactive. Now that therefore includes all the wives or husbands staying at home looking after the children, all the retired, etc. So you make this point back to that person, and I can tell you, he, and I'm pretty sure it was a he, then simply hit me with another false stat, which they had found out from somewhere else, as if I had never said a thing, and so on. Now, is it possible, now he didn't change his mind, is it possible that somebody reading that thread changed their minds, or was armed for a discussion that they were likely to have with somebody who came up with the same kind of stat? I think my inclination, actually, maybe it's just because of sheer obstinacy, or maybe it's because of what I do, is always to have the argument. Always, always, always to have the argument. If they're wrong, and you can show that they're wrong, tell them. And I don't care if it upsets them. And I don't care if in the end you lose their friendship, etc. Probably they're people not that worth knowing if they're kind of persistently wrong. But there is a cost. There's a price to be paid for the Enlightenment, I think.
Yes.
Different personality types are available.
I like that. That's cool.
Does the panel have anything? I mean, there were a couple of questions which I thought were related. One relating to, in a sense, the kind of the rise of the information war, and the other to do with the fact that actually levels of knowledge have been flat, and have governments done anything over time to try and address this? So, Bobby, thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, I think the idea that the internet would prove to be a neutral source of knowledge, that we'd all just become better informed over time, it looks incredibly naive, but we actually felt it at the time, I think. We did believe that type of thing. And what it forgot was the complete human aspects of how people will use those types of tools, that it's built in. What it is, you get, throughout history, there is talk of confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance, and it sort of is built into us to look for things that we already agree with and try and dismiss things that don't agree with us. This is not a new trait, and we didn't particularly build it into our thinking about how to do that. So so the surprise is that we didn't spot that coming, and we're very, very, very behind the curve on how this works. And the trouble is, and the challenge for government and multinational organisations, is that we're constantly behind the curve on that. We are, and the problem is not any individual actor or individual technology. It's the accelerating pace of change, and it just keeps changing ahead of us. So the great work that Full Fact and others talk about trying to get a principles-based approach to this is correct. We can't just legislate for now or regulate for now, because it'll be out of date before we do anything, and that's one of the challenges that the government has. So how do you actually get ahead of it instead of constantly trying to catch up with it? And having a more principles-based approach seems like the way forward. What that actually means in practice, how do you actually achieve that, is incredibly hard. There are examples from other spheres that you could maybe build on, but that's our challenge. It's not like, it's pointless looking to the past and what we could have done, because we were a bit naive about it, and it's pointless looking to the current and thinking about it now. We've got to think about how is this changing, what's the trajectory, what are the things. And it's the scary things, just as a very fun point on that, it's the scary things of, we are inches away from being able to fake video in an entirely convincing way, where you can type in words and Donald Trump will speak them to people, and then you can target that through your psychographic, whatever, segmentation to individuals, so you can get them to say different things to different people. And that's not a fake news type thing, that's more of a campaigning tool. We know that you can iterate 100,000 adverts in one single day with just tiny little tweaks, and that's not humans doing that, that's AI doing that. When you get it to video, when you can type things in and Donald Trump can be saying an entirely different thing to you than he is saying to you, then we've got a problem from a kind of Habermas public sphere point of view of what is the political reality anymore, when it's so tailored and individualised to us in an incredibly convincing weight. So those types are just a small example of there's probably many more that technologists will know about better than me, of how do you get ahead of that is our big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I would agree that thinking about what's happening now and what that will mean in the future will be incredibly powerful and useful thing to be doing, because so Bobby said, that we have to think about the human aspect of how these tools will be used as they are developed. Well, I think if that's relatively predictable, and some of it is with these, we know that cognitive biases are a very reliable effect. Well, if there's a very reliable effect, someone will look to profit from it. They will look to use it for economic or political or other gain. And so if we know that now, and we think about what kinds of scientific, technological, medical advances are coming ahead of us, then we need to be thinking, and how will those be used, and who will they affect, and how will they affect different groups differentially, and how will people who can profit from them be using them, and think ahead about how we need to shape that space in order to do that. So I'm very, very interested in research which thinks about how all these scientific and technological developments, which are accelerating, if anything, how will they be used? Who's going to look to profit from them, and what will that mean for different groups of people, and what could we put in place now that would help? So.
And David, the media scene is changing drastically around us. I mean, you touched a bit upon the kind of the way that we might want to try and put more money into local news, etc. But I mean, where is the initiative going to come from? What?
Well, I mean, actually, since we've just had this very interesting example, when Bobby was saying that about being able to fake video, and I suddenly realised that, of course, we're going to have to ban most of it. We are. I just don't see an alternative to saying effectively, we might have an exemption where people give specific permission for themselves to be used in this way, but otherwise we're going to have to say that to create images of people that look exactly like them and speak things they don't speak is actually an abuse and is illegal. And we're going to have to prepare to do it now. I just realised it, just as Bobby was saying it, and it fits it, and it's a problem for me given my usual stance on freedom of speech and expression, but they're going to have to be exemptions for that. But the threats to people are just too great. However, it also means that in general, that aside, we're going to be following up behind these things always. So the critical question, and it's the true question, it applies to the media as much as to anything else, is going to be how you prepare people in general for anything that might come along. So as ever, you find yourself going back to schools and parents and so on. I remember a very big argument I had about 15 years ago with Polly Toynbee when she said, media studies. She said, what a pathetic study, nobody should be studying it. And I said, if I'm right, in 20 years, it should be the first thing that you study, because you're going to need to know how to use this stuff, how to critically evaluate it. We have vastly more information available on the net, vastly more different sources of media. People create their own media. The essential question, and you can't know everything, but nevertheless, you're asked in a sense to kind of take a punt on how things are. So the question of authority, what authority you give to certain sorts of information and how you evaluate it becomes absolutely critical and essential. I mean, we've known this for quite some time. So the process of giving that or donating that authority to the sources of information you find on a continuous basis is going to be one of the most essential faculties that children are going to have as they become, even as they're children, in fact, even as children, not before they become adults. So I do think, I mean, I'm not dodging the question on media, but I think actually media will then will respond to the circumstances that we create for them to deal with. As long as most media is driven by the need to at least break even and some to kind of make money, then it will attempt to do what it thinks customers will pay for. And you will simply hope that the thing that you want to do, because I've always worked, obviously kind of broadsheet, high-end, mostly subsidised. Now, at the Times, because of the subscription model we've got, not subsidised. But I know all the kind of shortcuts we take in order to get more readers in, what kind of pictures you run and so on, in order to do it, the compromises that you make. You hope not to have to make too many compromises so that the stuff you're doing is not actually something that you don't want to do. But that's as long as that's the model, and it is going to be, then what you need, in a sense, is readers, viewers, and others who demand from you the thing that you want to give them, because frankly, if they don't, then you aren't going to exist. And so how are you going to create that feeling amongst people that that's what they want?
So I think we're coming to the end of our time, but I mean, that leaves us, I think, on a profoundly unsettling note, but, which is just what you need a drink for, so that's helpful. But I mean, you know, Bobby really wonderfully outlined the way that the perils of perception have been with us for a very long time, but given the new sort of technological age we find ourselves in, as I think Jennifer and David have talked about, these will be able to kind of supercharge and play upon the sort of issues that we face, as it were, and how society responds to it. I mean, that squiggle logo actually starts to kind of make sense, funnily enough, of the sort of issues that we now face. So I'd like you to thank Bobby, Jennifer and David for their wonderful presentations.